Hello and welcome to the Frank Islam Show. This is Frank Islam. We have with us today Gautam Adhikari, one of India's most reputed journalists. He edited the Times of India, the country's leading newspaper in the 1990s. Mr. Adhikari was also the founding editor of the newspaper Daily News Analysis in the early 2000s. It is a wonderful and privilege. I'm humbled and honored to have Gautam with us on our show. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Tell us a little bit about your background and your journey from the Times of India to United States of America, and what are you doing since then?
Well, I've been with the Times of India group since 1976. In between, I worked for the Hindu for a little while, for 3 years or so. But by and large, most of my journalistic career, I've been with the Times of India. But I took a break in 1987. In the fall of '87, I came to this country, to Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was at the Kennedy School of Government. And following that, the Times of India asked me whether I would like to continue as the Washington correspondent of the paper. So I moved to Washington with my family, and I was the Washington correspondent and White House correspondent for...
Since then?
For 5 years.
Okay.
Until I quit in '93, and I joined the World Bank for a couple of years. And I was there till mid '94. And then I went back to Times of India as the editor at that time, the executive editor.
And back to India?
Back to India. And from '94 to '97, I was executive editor of the Times of India. After which I spent a year in England working on a project there, came back to the United States, taught in George Washington University, then was associated with the National Endowment for Democracy. I was the project director of something called the World Movement for Democracy, which I founded with their help. And the first meeting of the World Movement for Democracy was in New Delhi.
Wow.
So
you ever had a distinguished career?
Well, varied career. I mean, life is short, so...
Life is short. We have a short time on this planet of Earth. We have so much to do.
Yes.
So let's just start with India. The country is going through massive changes, not just economically, politically, and socially. There's a lot of anger among the middle class people because of the deep corruption, deeply dysfunctional Congress, and deeply partisan politics. What is your take on this? And also please comment on the rape that just occurred in India. And I wrote a column in it. I wanted to have you share some of your thoughts, all the things that are going on in terms of the violence, in terms of the rape situation that occurred in New Delhi not too long ago.
At one level, whether it's corruption or whether it's rape, the issue is one of poor governance. And governance, as you are well aware, rests on two pillars. One is transparency, which in a democracy is relatively easy to ensure. And transparency also comes from the fact that India also has something called the Freedom of Information Act now. So you can get the information, and there's a free exchange of views, there's freedom of expression, you can talk about it. But the other aspect is accountability, and that is very poor in the Indian system, largely because the court system...
The judiciary system?
Yeah, the judiciary system is totally dysfunctional.
It's ancient.
It's dysfunctional.
Dysfunctional is a good way to put it.
You know, I saw a piece of statistic the other day where they said that if you started today to try and solve all the court cases that are pending in India, it'll take you 430 years to get to the last one.
Oh my goodness, that's a long time.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem to work at all. I mean, it's a very strange thing. So that's one big problem, and that is related to the fact of corruption and rape, in the sense that if there is little accountability and there is no punishment which is swift and decisive in the case of events like that, what happened on a moving bus in Delhi, then naturally, now they're trying to get around it. They're trying.
So there are some brighter horizons here?
Well, for rape cases, they've just started something called fast-track courts. And this particular case is being tried in a fast-track court. So it is bypassing the existing judicial system, but I mean, it's part of the judicial system, but it's called a fast-track court. I don't know whether that alone can solve the problem, but at least. But there's another problem, which is the general attitude of Indian males, I suppose, including all of us, towards women in general. I mean, India has had spectacular economic growth, but social growth has been very patchy.
So let's just shift the gears and talk about your book called Intolerant Indian, which deals a lot of things we're talking about. Is the liberal mindset shrinking in the country? Let me also add the fact that India always stood for equality, dignity, tolerance, and respect for other faith. And the minorities, they confront hostility and open prejudice. They share a city but not a community. They share a common dwelling but not a common effort. And they share a common fear. How can they set aside the differences to work for shared goal with a common commitment and shared sacrifices?
Well, my book is, I often have to stress that it's called The Intolerant Indian.
The Intolerant Indian.
And it's not Intolerant India, because India structurally is a very, as you rightly said just now, is a very tolerant framework. It has a constitution which is extraordinary.
Religions of freedom, no question about it.
Extraordinary constitution was drafted by the early founding fathers, and Ambedkar in particular, and it is still there despite some 275 amendments or something. It's still, by and large, a very, very tolerant and liberal constitution. But there are intolerant Indians who do not, I think, subscribe to the basic founding doctrine of the Indian nation, which is based on, as you observed, on equality,
dignity.
on dignity, on tolerance.
Respect for their faith.
There's no dignity for one person. There's dignity is always an exchange. If I don't have respect for you and you don't have respect for me, we cannot converse at an equal level. Now that is unfortunately a problem that has crept up in the Indian system, largely I think for a good reason, which is that democracy has spread. It's not a shallow venture, it's quite a deep venture in India. Democracy is really thriving.
So it's deeply rooted in society.
Yes, but unfortunately, because primary education and middle school education and all that has been ignored or non-existent. I mean, girls go to school and they usually drop out in northern India in many states like UP and Haryana and places like that. Now, the problem that arises is that the social growth factor has not matched the recent economic growth. There's a disparity there. So there's inequality developing because of economic growth, which is a normal.
You're talking about income inequality and injustice between the people who have it, who do not have it?
Right. One is income equality. The other is status inequality.
Yes.
And that is much wider, especially in a country where you have caste as a relatively important lingering factor still, though it is.
And the creed.
And then comes the fact that India is a country which probably houses all the major religions of the world.
No question.
And the largest minority, the Muslim minority, is I think about 13% of the population, which makes India the third largest.
Second largest.
Well,
after Indonesia is the second largest Muslim population in the world.
Right. Pakistan disputes that, so I think...
Well, we'll leave that to Pakistan to dispute it.
So even if it's third largest, it's
a fairly large population.
You know, it's 150 million people, or nearly half the population of the US. And by and large, mind you, there are very, very successful people from the Muslim community in the Indian system. We have had presidents who are Muslim.
Current vice president is a Muslim as well.
Till recently, the richest Indian was a Muslim, Azim Premji. Then the movie stars. I mean, there are so many. I mean,
you're talking about all the cons.
Yeah, but then you come to events like what happened in Gujarat in 2002.
You're absolutely
and
right.
all the riots that have taken place. And my book deals primarily with intolerance that is religion-based, but also with problems of freedom of expression, problems that women face in India, where intolerance is not overt, but it underlies our attitude and behavior towards women.
So they need to re-examine their behavior towards the woman, towards the minority, towards the caste, towards the creeds, as an individual, as a nation, as a community.
Yes, indeed. But that's where the political leadership becomes a problem, because you suddenly, you see, when you started the Indian experiment, you had a situation where it was really elite driven. After all, the constitution was written primarily in the English language, and very few people at that time really spoke English.
Right.
Though it was translated and you can read it in Hindi, but that's not the point. The point is, at that time you had major figures like Nehru and Maulana Azad and Rajendra Prasad and all these people, Radhakrishnan, who were all essentially part of the Indian elite. They were very liberal, they were secular minded by and large, and they tried to instill a certain set of principles in the Indian system, but that was not successful with the abject failure of primary education, especially in the rural areas. And India is by and large still a rural country. It's getting urbanized fast, so people from the rural areas are moving into the cities, but without the necessary equipment, the intellectual, mental equipment.
And the infrastructure is not there to sustain them.
Exactly. The infrastructure is another major problem out there.
We'll come back after the break. So we'll take a break. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back. We have been talking to the former editor of the India's newspaper, Times of India, Gautam. Tell us a little bit about what kind of future you see for India in the short term and long term, politically, socially, and economically. And do you believe that the GDP growth that India has achieved is sustainable? In the short term and the long term as well.
Actually, you know, contrary to what many people say, I think that the short term is brighter than the longer term. Most people would go the other way and say that, oh, in long term India will become a superpower, India will do this, India will do that, and be most important nation in the world and all that kind of thing. For me, the long term really depends on the short term, and I think the short term looks extremely easy to achieve success in. For instance, if you can somehow get back to the GDP growth that you had for about 5 or 6 years,
yes,
in a row, and then cross that and say touch about 10% or so. It's fine. As you know, it has dropped back. It has dropped below 6%. It's
I believe so. I think they only did a 5.2%, if I remember correctly, last year.
They're much weaker now. Yeah. Now, part of that is...
It's still pretty good compared to our GDP growth. We've only had about 3.2% or 3% GDP growth.
Yes,
but our economy is a lot bigger.
Right,
bigger.
And it's a developed economy. And an advanced economy, to have a 3% growth is a very high rate. You haven't achieved it at this point of time. It will come. I think the American economy is chugging along nicely, and unless there's a crisis in Europe, that's a different thing. But in India's case, even a 5.2% or 5.5% growth rate is not enough, because you have to look at it in relative terms and look at the rates at which China has grown over the last 3 decades. And that average rate of growth is over 10%. I mean, leave alone the current rate of growth. And when they've dropped to 7%, they are worried in China. So in India's case, it has dropped to 5 or 5.5. Now, it's quite likely that with the world economy picking up, the Indian economy will also start picking up. And there's
what about the economic reform that the Prime Minister Singh just instituted? Do you see any kind of a change in the GDP growth because of that, because the foreign company will have access to the middle class Americans?
Some of it, yes.
Excuse me, middle class Indians.
Middle class Indians, yes. Some of it, yes, because with foreign investment coming into retail, into insurance and all kinds of other sectors, they would. But you know, there's no shortage.
Especially the retail sector we're talking about, which is the Walmart.
Yes, that's the thing. But there's no shortage of investable capital in India.
Oh.
So in a way, India doesn't depend on foreign investment. India,
on the other hand, Chinese do depend.
The Chinese do. They are a much more
on the consumption of the foreign individuals.
Right.
In order for them to sustain the economy.
Exactly. They are.
You said it very well.
They are export driven.
Yes.
Whereas in India's case, exports as a proportion of overall GDP has risen. But at this point of time, India is still not export dependent. It is not even that dependent on foreign capital, though it requires, of course, foreign capital and opening up and being say lacking or let's say not being hostile towards free trade is something that is always beneficial for economic growth. But at the same time, India's domestic demand is huge. Now, how that domestic demand would be serviced is the question, and that's where the reforms that are necessary in the Indian economic system, the decentralization of economic decision making that is required, the enormous, on the negative side, the enormous control that government officials, both at the central and the state level, still maintain over decision making that lead to economic growth is astounding.
That's the best way to describe astounding.
But that is why
it will also stagnate their economy if they continue that path.
Yes, because it's related to power equations. It is related to the fact that the whole Indian model of growth has been driven by old socialistic dreams. And even today, although there are a lot of people who are much more open to the idea of a free market and free trade, mindsets are still very much, drenched in socialistic thought. They don't talk. They don't say. If you ask them, they don't say, "I'm not socialist."
But because there are a lot of competing interest among the chief ministers of some of the states, which is in this case, Ms. Banerjee, as I understand, Mrs. Banerjee pulled out of the cabinet because of the fact that she didn't think that economic reform is going to help. So there are a lot of competing. There's not a convergence there in the thought. There are a lot of competing thoughts there. And that's one of the reasons the politics are deeply partitioned there.
Yeah, from 1989 onwards, you would have noticed that all of Indian politics has changed from a one-party rule to a succession of coalition governments. Even Narasimha Rao, when he was
the Prime Minister of India.
Many people think that was a Congress. No, it wasn't. It was a coalition government. And in fact, Narasimha Rao had to do a lot of unhealthy stuff for the political system to try and maintain that coalition. And I think he was even convicted of paying off some coalition partners to stay in power. But the fact is, when you have coalitions, and a lot of these coalitions are based on regional interests and regional parties, whether it's in Tamil Nadu, whether it's in West Bengal. It's
UP?
Or UP or Punjab. There's a lot of regional interests that are coming up and, asserting themselves. And they are represented in the coalitions that are there in New Delhi. So that is not necessarily a bad thing for democracy if coalition management is a political skill that is there in the leadership. Now, so somehow or other Narasimha Rao managed it. The old Janata government in the late 70s couldn't manage it. BJP also managed it for the 6 years that they were overall in power. I think they also relatively, and I must give credit to Mr. Manmohan Singh for his first term, that he did manage the coalition partners fairly well, including...
So what's going to happen this time around?
That's where the problem arises, is that there is such a weakening at the central level of governance and governance tactics that anybody, any of the coalition partners can threaten a pullout.
So they're calling the shot, in a sense?
In some ways, you see, when political, like let's say some of the Republicans in Congress out here, when you say that...
They become sort of hostile a little bit.
Yeah, when you say that, look, to hell with national interest, I'm going to bring down this government, or I'm not letting this government function, then, and Mamata Banerjee in a way symbolizes that attitude, because West Bengal is not growing. There's nobody investing there. And she symbolizes in a different way also. She's the one who actually led the agitation against the Tata automobile plant in West Bengal, which
didn't make any sense to me. They will create a job, it will build prosperity, create a wealth
It
for her constituency.
I thought it wouldn't make sense to the West Bengal population either, but they actually elected her to power after that. So,
well, let's just shift our gear, if we may, to shed a little bit light of a U.S.-India relationship. Where we are, where we have been, where are we going?
Well, where we have been is easier to talk about than where we are going. Because where we have been is that for about more than 40 years, close to 50, we were effectively in different camps in world politics. India called itself non-aligned, and it was by and large independent in its foreign policy, but still it leaned very closely to the Soviet camp. And in several instances, in 1956, for instance, when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, or in 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, India didn't say anything. Even when the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, and India, it was the Indira Gandhi government at that time, I think, not when it went in, but after that, it was like, oh, all foreign powers should stay out of Afghanistan. Now, that doesn't say anything. That doesn't really, I mean, we didn't really, from India, we didn't really make ourselves that clear on where we stood in the early stages of the Afghan conflict. However, with the opening of the economy in 1991, I mean, as you know very well, you're a very successful businessman yourself, that when you deal with other people in economic terms, in business terms, in financial terms.
You have to be part of the global economy.
Yeah, and you have to understand how the other person sees the world.
Absolutely right.
And you have to reach some kind of a deal.
Yeah,
now, totally deal making is central to business,
exactly.
as you know in your successful career. So therefore, that deal making phase began in real earnest from 91, when the Indian economy started opening up.
When they opened up their economy.
Yeah, but unfortunately, even the reforms and the opening up of the economy didn't really go far enough at that point, which goes back to your earlier question on what do I think of the reform process. I think it really slowed down. It's in a traffic jam right now.
Traffic jam is the best way to end our conversation. Thank you very much for coming. We'll continue our conversation on the next show, and we will try to engage and get to know each other a little bit more. Thank you very much. This is our show. This is Frank Islam, wishing you a great week.